Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had someone in the comments actually ask me if I thought it was possible for someone to reach their maximum muscle size doing only max effort work. Now, by max effort work, we're going to call that hitting 90% to 100% of your 1 rep max on a variety of lifts for 1 rep, right? Doing nothing but 1 rep. And here's been largely my experience with it, my observations over the years. I think there are lifters who've been very successful out there who've used Bulgarian style training. I know a number who have. I've messed with it myself over the years. In fact, I did it for 7 months last year, drew my own conclusions from it. Part of the problem with doing only max effort type work is, number one, the fatigue it generates over time, the psychological fatigue, the physical fatigue, and the lack of sheer training volume. And when I say lack of volume, you can't just come in and hit tons of heavy singles and get away with it. There's going to be a finite limit. When we start hitting 90% or above, you can only get away with so many in a session, and in some cases even per week, and there are problems with it. And if you look at the various lifters who have successfully used it, there's some things you're going to notice in common. Number one, the guys who use it successfully tend to be pretty heavy on the gear. You can look at their physiques and tell. And what do we know about anabolics? We know that anabolics can create muscle without even training, right? And people can argue about that all day long. You can argue about it all day long. We have multiple studies confirming it. Not only do we have multiple studies confirming it, we have clinical trials on sick people. And if you look at it, that's what these things were designed for. They were designed for sick people to gain muscle, oftentimes while laying in a bed. All right, we're talking about sometimes burn victims laying in the ICU, who they put 20 pounds of muscle back on. People with severe muscle wasting, diseases of different types. That's who these things were developed for. That is their intended medical application. These things work. They work very well. That's the reason they still exist as prescriptions. They work. So a lot of these guys, they don't always have a lot of training volume, and then the argument would be maybe they don't necessarily need it, because also it's one of the things we note about the guys who do that style of training. They sometimes are at a lighter body weight. In other words, they get the most absolute efficiency they need for just their main lifts, but they're lacking sometimes in overall musculature because they've only developed the muscles they need for those main lifts. They tend to be at very low body fats, and they've used anabolics, though, to thicken their musculature up and help them get leaner while doing so. They haven't provided oftentimes adequate training stimulus, so they get away with it. And they get away with it successfully. And I mean, I've seen some dudes out there who are incredibly strong, pretty jacked, but like not as quite as jacked as you would expect, who obviously use stuff, right? Who obviously use stuff very, very lean. The only guys who do this who are really successful, who might be natural, and I'm not going to name any names, I'm going to insult anybody, a big name in the industry who has promoted this and used it over the years, is really, really fat. Right? He's not someone who you would think of as being an in-shape athlete, but he has gotten pretty dang strong doing it. Again, great credentials. We know who I speak of, those who look into it, and those who don't will realize it down below. But the guy probably stays at 30+% body fat. The guy's easily over 25, maybe 30%, and never deviates below that. Well, when you start thinking about that in terms of food intake and anabolic effect, we know that overeating makes you gain muscle. Okay? People say, what do you mean? Fat people have more muscle than skinny people who've never touched a weight in their life. Bulking, and this is contrary to what people believe, bulking will make you bigger and stronger irrespective of your training. It will also facilitate better recovery from training. It will stimulate muscle growth. It will do all of those things. The problem is that bulking up to a high body fat makes you fat and it makes you unhealthy. Let me state that again. It makes you fat and it makes you unhealthy. It has an anabolic effect. In other words, even if you were getting insufficient total training stimulus, if you just overate enough to get fat, you would gain significant amounts of muscle. Well, you take a system like that where it's all max effort work, just geared towards, maximum strength through given movement patterns. you're getting some training effect. Combine that with any external source of muscle growth, whether it's overeating excessive amounts of food, which again creates a similar effect to a low dose of anabolic. It actually does. Or people who are just flat using hefty amounts of gear, they get jacked and strong. It's just in one case they get jacked and strong, and the other they get fat and strong. It works, but the problem is the insufficient training volume. And even then, all the guys who do that, they still always do a bunch of upper back work and things like that, because they find, even for guys who want to do, say, squat, bench, and deadlift off max effort work, they still do all that supplemental work. You have to have more training volume. And I found the same thing. I ran Bulgarian for 7 months last year. 7 months. Then I started doing my cuts on a DEXA scan. Now, people need to keep in mind, people are like, well, you did seem to gain some muscle. Well, I was also gaining body weight again because I just didn't track my calories. So intake goes up for me because I have that appetite combined with muscle memory. So yeah, my lift shot back up. I got to where I was doing squatting 485 5 or 6 days every week. All this other stuff. But I was still doing some upper back work and smaller supplemental lifts. But then when I tried to maintain that and started cutting and even adding in a little bit of cardio, I started losing some muscle tissue. Why? Because the training volume is insufficient on pure max effort work. It is insufficient. It's insufficient. You're not going to stimulate enough muscle growth. So let's talk about this from the perspective of programming. That's been my own experience with it. And I think max effort work is phenomenal. Like, I pretty much promote that other than maybe short phases of adaptation, I'd like to see everybody eventually get over to doing max effort work. I do it every week. But what are we doing it on? Only 2 exercises. Doesn't mean we might not occasionally pull a heavy single or something on some other lifts. Do it on 1 exercise. I would argue that people who do max effort work don't need as much of kind of the dead zone rep ranges. Right? What do we think of the hybrid rep range? That 80 to 90%. That's kind of your hybrid rep range. That's for people who, if they wanted to stick to just 1 rep range, they could get generally big and generally strong, decent at maxes, all that stuff, right? Do a bunch of doubles and triples and 4s, 5s. I would argue that people who do max effort work could largely disregard that rep range and put everything else into training volume. If you do enough max effort work to just get good at maxing, I think you can disregard that. And look at the system that I use, right? Let's look at some of the max effort work, the speed work, and then all just the volume training for hypertrophy. And I'm not saying you don't get hypertrophy from the max work or the speed work, because you do. Then we come down to, though, if you are doing max effort work on a couple of different lifts every week and you're doing this stuff, you're already training your maximum strength. You are getting a training response. The only time you've got to do large amounts of it is if you're trying to maybe peak because you haven't done it for a while. So you get used to doing it, you're just used to lifting maximum weights. You can gear all your other training towards other elements and even towards just hypertrophy to where they feed each other. Meaning if your maxes are going up, even your volume work is getting stronger. Therefore, you're getting more total overload. They can feed into each other. What I would suggest is do a minimum amount of max effort work. You need to do it all the time. I think the West Side guys get that right. And that's what I'm doing these days. That's the direction to go. No, do your max effort work, and then all your other training can be geared towards other performance elements without regard for does this carry over to a 1 rep max. Because you're doing 1 rep maxes already. You already have the specificity of that. Right? You can make everything else be focused on explosiveness, speed, hypertrophy, right? The training volume on top of it. I think that's the direction to go. If someone says they want to be really jacked, they want to be really jacked without drugs, that's what I would do. Put the focus on combining these two things together. Right? We don't need to be dogmatic and say, oh, only this one tool. Like, how are you going to get maximally jacked and maximally strong off of saying, I'm just going to use this one tool because I'm too lazy to learn how to make them all flow together? You need to be using every tool at your disposal. Unless you're a genetic freak on 2 grams of gear, you better learn how to incorporate all of these tools. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.